Good evening. Welcome to Left, Right and Centre. There's passion and anger about Hindi being put on a pedestal vis-a-vis other languages, this time in Karnataka. After the Bollywood actor Ajay Devgn tweeted that Hindi is India's national language to the Kannada actor Kichcha Sudeep, there's an outpouring of support for Sudeep from Karnataka's Chief Minister, two former Chief Ministers and scores of others, with the controversy taking on a political colour. It started with a debate triggered by the runaway success of Pushpa, RRR and the latest KGF Chapter 2, movies from South India that have done way better than Bollywood releases. It ended up becoming a political debate on language. We'll be debating that in the next few minutes, but also on this program, the intense heat wave across the subcontinent, record temperatures for this time of the year in some areas. Gurgaon nearly 46 degrees Celsius. It is among the hottest Aprils in the national capital region. Is this a random extreme weather event, or is this a direct link to climate change? Well, we're going to immediately move on to our top story. Karnataka politicians backing the actor Sudeep in criticizing Bollywood's Ajay Devgn. Let me go straight across to Prakash Belwadi, who joins us. We are also joined by Abhishek Tripathi, the filmmaker and columnist. Adagur Vishwanath is a senior BJP leader and MLC from Karnataka. We're also joined by Manikam Tagore, the AICC in charge for Telangana, and Kasturi Shankar, the actor and activist. I'd like to thank you all very much for being with us. Prakash Belwadi, let me come to you first. Is this really about Hindi, or is this about a fight between Kannada superstars and Bollywood superstars and the films that they produce?
It may be a little bit of a battle of the turf, but I don't think that is how it started. I think it was quite an innocuous tweet from both sides. I'll tell you first, the comment from Sudeep that I read in the morning in the papers was that, he said that, why are you calling them as films from the South? We are as much pan-Indian film as anybody else. And, that is because I think there's a rush of enthusiasm because this is the first time in many decades that Kannada is getting this kind of Kannada feature film is getting this kind of national attention. And I'm a Kannadiga and we are all very proud of Yash. But there is also a bit of, I'll say, awkward morality involved here, because for about 6 or 7 decades, Karnataka's film industry has not allowed dubbing of other language films into Kannada. They've not even allowed dubbing on television of serials. So only it's after the Competition Commission of India intervened.
So those films and serials which have been done in Hindi haven't been dubbed in Kannada, is what you're mentioning?
Not just Hindi, any language in Karnataka.
Manikam Tagore, this is an interesting point that Mr. Belawadi makes, that in as much as people can say that, look, it's all very well to promote local in terms of languages, and I mean it's our heritage, but at the same time, linguistic chauvinism extends also to states.
Important thing is that we should respect each other's language. First is respecting each other's language.
Right.
It's the industry, what we are speaking about, Kannada film industry and Hindi film industry, it's an industry. But respecting each other's language is more important, and imposition of any language on the other language is going to be dangerous in India. India has multiple languages, and we need to celebrate that multiplicity and diversity also. This is oneness story which this government, particularly from the RSS mindset, is being pushed from the top of oneness on language, food, color, everything oneness. That is dangerous. That's the main important thing, and that industry, whatever Kannada industry takes it about their dubbing and other languages and others, that's a commercial angle. But this story of imposing a language on other language or treating the other language as inferior language.
You're giving us a fairly diplomatic answer to this, but that's fair and that's your prerogative. Abhishek Tripathi, there are many, and if you just look at the statistics, the number of native Hindi speakers in India only around 44%, which includes speakers of languages such as Bhojpuri. So the moment we start saying Hindi and national language in the same breath, then people in other parts of the country have a problem.
No, when we say, or anybody says that Hindi is a national language, basically it's because of the reason that Hindi can be understood and can be spoken to a good extent at every corner of the country. So that is one reason why it's said.
Not true.
Also,
But that's debatable, you know.
Not true. That's
That's-
not true. That's inaccurate.
that's debatable when I go for a shooting to Chennai or Hyderabad or any of these places. Apart from the English, it's the Hindi that I speak, at least because I don't know the local language. But,
No, but Hindi is not understood
We
in
all-
Tamil Nadu or in Kerala in large parts.
we all
It's
respect.
it's
we
just
all
not. In
respect
fact, it's English
every-
which is a lot
No,
more
no.
understood.
That's what I'm saying. We all respect every regional languages. Every language has its own history and its heritage. So by no means it's that we are, kind of marginalizing any language. Only thing is, because this is largely spoken across the country, that's why it's there.
Kasturi Shankar, would you agree that this is mostly spoken? It is a link language in that sense, and therefore it needs to be seen as our national language, Hindi.
I think North Indians and Hindi speakers, and again, I love Hindi, I respect Hindi, I respect North Indians, but we end up having this divisive discussion right now. But here's how it is. Mr. Tripathi, we speak in Hindi to you because you're incapable of speaking in Tamil to us. If you respected our language the way we respect yours, you would actually make an effort to speak in Tamil. When you go to a foreign country, you make the effort. You go to France, you make the effort to speak in French. But inside your own country, you don't make the effort. You assume that people will talk to you in Hindi. And the best obligation you can do for us is you speak in English. willy-nilly speak in English. अरे ये लोग तमिलनाडु में हिंदी क्यों बोलते हैं, क्यों नहीं बोलते हैं, हमें इंग्लिश में बात करना पड़ता है. That is the kind of reaction I get from a lot of Hindi speakers who seem to assume that Hindi somehow is the link language. Where is it the link language? I was in Meghalaya, Assam. I toured 4 different northeastern states in January, and most of them are BJP states, by the way, and not a single person there wanted to speak to me in Hindi. They said, please speak in English because we don't understand Hindi. This is in the cities. We are talking about Guwahati. We are talking about Shillong. We are talking about Kohima. These are places where they do not welcome Hindi as their preferential language. There are huge tourist spots. And they still prefer English.
Okay, one second, Kasturi. Abhishek Tripathi, would you like to respond to that? Hindi is not a link language.
I more than agree. But like I said before, it's majority of the places I'm saying. Now, if you're talking about some of the places in northeastern states or any other places,
what is majority of places? Come outside the Hindi belt and talk.
When I say no, but I'll tell you, humanly, it's not possible for me to learn because I have not. It's not been part of my curriculum throughout.
So don't mistake.
Tamil and
There we go.
So then why is it one language
we
or
have
the
been
other?
for 50,
Mr. Tripathi,
for
that's
75 years.
Nobody is
half a
imposing.
second.
Nobody.
That's the key point. Why
Nobody is
impose one
imposing.
language on the other?
No.
If you are not in a position to learn
Nobody
the other
said to
language,
impose.
nobody is blaming you for
I
that.
fail to
One
understand.
is only suggesting
Vishnu,
you have your language.
Vishnu, I
Others
fail
have their
to
language.
understand. Nobody is imposing. Nobody is
But
imposing
then
the
why
language.
call
Who's
Hindi a
imposing?
national language when only what 40 odd % speak?
आप तो पैदा होते हैं हिंदी बात करके आप पैदा हो जाते हैं. आप तो जिंदगी भर हिंदी बोलकर आप जी लेते हैं. But it is imposed on us. We have a 3-language policy. We have to compulsorily learn Hindi for 75 years. Slowly, Hindi has been inculcated into everybody's stream.
Exactly what I'm trying to say.
Sir, please. Why has there not been a 3-language policy where you grew up in? Why were you not mandatorily asked to learn a South Indian language? Why is the policy only there for South India and Northeast India? Why do Hindi speakers
I know
not
Mr. Tagore is
learn
waiting.
This is
Mr.
something
Tripathi,
which we
reply
can't
to
take
that,
up.
and then I'll go across to Mr. Tagore. Yes, go ahead. Mr.
No, this
Tripathi.
is something why we don't have to study and why you have to study. This is something I cannot comment for. That's
That
been
is
for
imposition.
last.
That is the definition of imposition.
Whoever.
We have to adjust to you. We have to speak your tongue. You guys won't.
If I live in Mumbai and Maharashtra, or if I live in Mumbai and Maharashtra or Haryana or Uttar Pradesh or Bihar or Madhya Pradesh or Himachal, I'm not sure they will put up Telugu, Tamil, Kannada or Malayalam as a language. But this is not in our
Similarly, people in Tamil Nadu may not want Hindi, or people in Kerala may not want Hindi. People in Karnataka may not want Hindi either.
This is there in the system. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to say this has been. This has been the
This has
system.
been
I've
the
studied
system.
Maharashtra.
System has to change.
But
Since I
sir,
was there in
Abhishek
Maharashtra,
high time
Kasturi,
the
half a
system
second.
changed.
Kasturi, can I edge in
Since
the
I
anchor of the
since
show?
I am
Just
here
half
in
a
Maharashtra,
second,
I studied
half a
Maharashtra.
second. Abhishek ji, that's just the point. This has been the system, and why this has been a debate for decades. Because there is a sense that you cannot impose a linguistic preference on others because language is identity.
See, all I can say is I live here in Mumbai and Maharashtra.
In as much as Bengali
So
may
I
be
know Marathi.
my mother tongue, and therefore something closest to me, I wouldn't
Vishnu,
like it if somebody imposes some other
Vishnu,
language like Tamil or Hindi or anything on me.
Vishnu,
It's
Vishnu,
unfair.
I live in
and I'm
I
sure
live
you
in
wouldn't
Mumbai
want
and
my language to
Vishnu,
be imposed on
Vishnu,
you. I respect
Vishnu,
your
I live-
language, you
listen,
respect mine.
listen.
We all live happily.
Listen, I live in Mumbai and Maharashtra, so I got the opportunity to learn Marathi, so I did it. Had I been there in Telugu, in Tamil Nadu, or in Andhra Pradesh, or Telangana, or I sure would have been able to. So this
And
is
when
what
we
I'm
come
saying
to
is.
North India, we will learn ना. हमारे schools में क्यों पढ़ाते हैं?
No, but Abhishek ji,
This is something I can
when the
comment
Home
on.
Minister presides over a parliamentary official language committee meeting and makes statements that 70% of the agenda of the cabinet is prepared in Hindi, the time has now come to make Hindi an important part of the unity of the country. I understand the point about unity. I mean, it's a slightly separate issue. But the moment you impose 70% of the agenda of the cabinet in Hindi, people may not even be able to understand it. How does that help us as Indians?
See, what he meant, our Home Minister, what he meant was, instead of having the bridge as English language, let's have Hindi. He's not comparing Hindi with Tamil and Telugu. He's comparing with English. Let English not be that bridge. Let Hindi be that bridge.
Wow.
By saying that and by doing that...
Manikam Tagore, how would you reply to this point? That let Hindi be a bridge if there has to be one and not English. There are those who say
That's
that
what he
English
said.
is more understood across our country than any other language.
No, the main issue is that, as Mr. Tripathi was saying about who is imposing, he was asking. The Prime Minister and the Home Minister goes to Tamil Nadu and Kerala. All along, whomever being the Prime Minister, maybe Atalji, maybe Manmohan Singh ji, maybe anybody, nobody speaks in Hindi to Tamil Nadu. Only Prime Minister Modi and Amit Shah speaks to Hindi to Tamil Nadu. Because they know that thing that there is an aversion about Hindi in Tamil Nadu, but that is imposition. Where you are saying about imposition, who is imposing, you are saying,
No, but that's also a bit unfair, Mr. Tagore. If the Home Minister or the Prime Minister are most comfortable in Hindi, then they aren't imposing it. They just happen to be speaking the language that they like speaking.
No.
You want them to speak in English, then Hindi?
No. Please, let me. I had been hearing you all.
Yes.
Just let me put my point and I'll welcome this thing. Prime Minister, if he is not knowing English, no issues. But Prime Minister knows English. He speaks to Obama in English without any aids. He speaks to Trump in English without aids. Therefore, let us understand that he knows English. For he wants to show, if he has spoken Gujarati, because his mother tongue is Gujarati, if he speaks to Gujarati in Tamil Nadu, that is good. There can be a translation there for also. But to impose Hindi and one language on Tamil Nadu is unfair. One. Second, you told about the same thing happens to Mizoram also. It's the same thing happened to Nagaland also. The same thing happens to Manipur also. The same thing happens to today also in Assam also. You are speaking about Hindi. Okay, that imposition is the issue. Second, I'll come to you are telling about large number of people of speaking. I just remember a quote by our former Chief Minister Annadurai. He told that because large number of people speaks if you go for number, then crow should be the national bird because crows are more in India. You should not make peacock as national emblem because it is not the number, it is the sentiment part. Because you are killing other languages, you want to show to other languages you are secondary, and nobody is ready to learn other language. That's the issue. If somebody wants to learn Tamil, you make a provision that other languages you should read, secondary, some regional languages.
Okay.
Let any one of my friends, whomever I know, whomever he speaks Hindi, won't learn a second language, or Kannada, or Tamil, or Telugu, or Marathi, or Bengali.
It is deeply problematic, but there is a political association at one level on language and patriotism, Hindi and patriotism, Hindi and nationalism. There is a sense. For example, in 2018, the External Affairs Minister, who was the late Sushma Swaraj, went to the United Nations and said that Hindi needs to be made an official language of the United Nations because it's spoken in Fiji, Mauritius, Trinidad, Tobago and Suriname. So Hindi is India, whereas some would suggest that in fact it's not. All our languages are India, including English, I dare say.
Exactly. I do agree.
So
May I actually quickly
patriotism shouldn't be associated only with Hindi is the point, which I'm making. Kasturi, last comment. I'm out of time.
Yes. I have to say one thing to Mr. Tagore, though, which he's not going to really like. The whole emphasis on Hindi and the equation of Hindi to patriotism, I think is a very Gandhian situation, and Mahatma Gandhi was the first person to actually promulgate Hindi be the unifying voice of India. Mr. Ambedkar actually was dead against it. Many Muslim and South Indian leaders were against Hindi. Mr. Ambedkar actually supported Sanskrit as a link language. Many other leaders supported Bengali and South Indian languages.
So we are back to square one as far as our language debate is concerned. But let's hope we can keep arguing about it and not have anybody impose their views on what we can say and what we can't. Thanks very much for being with us on this program. We're going to change topic to something which affects billions of people, more than 1 billion people across the subcontinent, the intense heat wave. This is a very important story. I really needed to have given more time to it. And the reason we are discussing this is because, just as an example, in the national capital region, it is almost 46 degrees in Gurgaon today. Other parts of the country, Hisar above 7 degrees. Prayagraj above 5 degrees, almost 46 degrees. Rajgarh above 3 degrees. Akola above 3 degrees normal, right? Khajuraho 2 degrees above normal at almost 45 degrees. And we can go on and on. Now this heat wave that we are actually seeing with Gurugram on Delhi's outskirts at almost 46 degrees, many would suggest has very little to do with a sudden event or a one-off event. In fact, it's part of a trend which we've seen for a long period of time. Joining us now, Professor Navroz Dubhash, Professor of the Center for Policy Research. He joins us from Singapore. We're also joined by Professor Kichcha Sudeep. He's a professor of the Center for Atmospheric Sciences at IIT Delhi. I'd like to thank you all very much for being with us. Navroz Dubhash, first question to you. How would you respond to those who say that, these things happen sometimes? Or is this actually linked to climate change?
Well, thank you, Vishnu, for having me on the show and for actually having a show on this topic. I think at this point, the evidence that the globe is under serious threat from the impacts of climate change is now indisputable. Any individual weather event, it's much harder to tell whether a particular event like this heat wave is directly tied to climate change. One has to do the detailed studies, but it is very, very clear that what we are seeing in terms of more heat waves, what we are seeing in terms of extreme weather events, what we are seeing in terms of coastal disruptions is very, very consistent with what the science has been predicting. And so that gives us a lot of confidence that, in fact, what we are seeing dismayingly so is, in fact, the first manifestations of climate change. It's not a future issue, it's a here and now issue. It's upon us already.
Professor Kichcha Sudeep, in simple terms, why is this happening? A heat wave of this intensity?
Well, there's a high pressure system over North India and Pakistan and extending out, which essentially presses the air down and keeps us bright and sunny, doesn't allow for wind to circulate and cool things off. So this is a weather system that happens whenever there's a heat wave. There's typically a high pressure, but that's the current now. But as Navroz said, these kinds of events are something that we have seen increase. The data shows that there are increasing heat wave events across the globe, and certainly over India. There are, especially over northwest parts of India, there has been an increasing trend. And that's fully consistent with all of the science that climate change science tells us. So certainly this is part of the trend that we are seeing, and we can expect as we go forward, if we don't do anything about climate change at the global level.
Professor Dubhash, how is this linked to climate change and these extreme weather events associated to a large extent with more extreme events in a shorter period of time. For example, last year there were two cyclones, one on the eastern seaboard, one on the western seaboard, within a period of a couple of days. Extremely intense. There were lightning storms in a short period of time across large parts of the center of the country. Many people lost their lives. There was a pattern of glacial melt which we saw increasing with greater intensity in 2021 than we've seen perhaps at any stage of our history that's been recorded. So how is intensification of all of these things a key part of what is dangerous?
Well, Vishnu, I'm not a climate scientist, and Krishna is, which is why I'm very glad he's on the show. The reasons for the individual reasons for each of these lie in the complexities of climate science. It's one of the more complex areas of science. There's a lot of extremely powerful computing that goes into developing these models, and which is why the incidents that you describe are very important, because they kind of bring to light what the implications of this are for the public. But then you have to step back and say, what is the broad pattern here, and can we be confident that the broad pattern is consistent with what we think will happen in a climate warming world? And that's why it's important to go back to some of the more systematic work, right? I think it's important for people like Krishna and myself not necessarily to leap to conclusions about individual events, but when we step back and we look at the broad pattern and we look at what is being predicted by, for example, bodies like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, then it seems likely that what you are describing, these individual instances, are part of that broader pattern. Let me pause for a second and give you an example of the sorts of things the panel has been saying in its report just a couple of months ago. When it comes to South Asia, it says there's clear evidence for coastal flooding in cities and heat-related impacts. It finds that globally, we've seen that there have been mass mortality events of species. So, we talk about things like heat waves that we can perceive, but that's just the tip of the proverbial iceberg, in the sense it's a bad metaphor since we're talking about a heat wave, but there's a lot more going on between the surface. There's turmoil going on in the biosphere, in ecosystems and their relationship to the natural world around.
Sure.
And so this kind of churning and turmoil manifests in things like the extreme events that you're talking about. But if you go back and look at what the science says, we are actually moving into those patterns of more extreme rainfall events, more heat waves, more drought-like conditions, and so on and so forth.
Professor Rao, final question to you. Is the churning that Navroz spoke about more intense in the subcontinent over the last few years than it is in many other parts of the world?
Well, that would be hard to pinpoint. There are certainly things that indicate that, but for us to say one region is more intensely suffering these things than others requires a lot of data that we have to look at, data that goes back in time, and perhaps we need to do those studies to show one way or the other. But that's besides the point. Whether it's the most intense change in the world or not, it is bad enough that we have to be paying attention to it. And certainly everything that Navroz just talked about and all of those examples that you cited clearly indicate to us scientists that this is physically consistent with what we understand about science. There's no surprises here. We are trapping heat, and that heat is going to let loose heat waves. It is going to make the waters warmer in the oceans, which is going to set off cyclones. The extra heat is going to melt your glaciers and the snow and all of that. So there's no, this is not rocket science. This is fairly straightforward, even though Navroz says it's complicated science. This is high school level science that can tell us that this is what will happen. So I think in terms of understanding what's happening on the subcontinent, we need a lot more analysis and data to be able to pinpoint not just how things are changing, but also how things might go in the future, which is where we have to focus now, because we've dotted the I's, crossed the T's in terms of telling people what changes have occurred.
And we don't have time. We can't.
Right.
We can't
We
waste
now
a minute on
need.
this.
That's right. We need to look forward to see what is coming down the pipe for us. What can we do about it? Because whether or not the global climate emissions problem gets solved, climate has changed, and it will change a little more, maybe a lot more. And that's where our focus needs to be as to how we're going to deal with those changes coming down the line.
Look, gentlemen, it's been fantastic speaking to you. I regret that our programs have to end, but this one does. But I'd like to invite you both again to discuss this in the future. We have a lot of space and time on this network for this issue. It affects billions around the world. Thank you very much for being with us. We are out of time on this program, but just before I leave you, we've got a compilation of some of the comments which have come in on our previous discussion, the language debate, Hindi versus those who believe that Hindi should not be our national language, isn't our national language. Tanay says, why do celebrities and politicians get into small issues of religion and languages instead of working for the betterment of the country? Surya says, how to meet the surging power demand, referring to this situation now because of the mercury rising in many states. That's a key issue, also linked in a way to climate change. Out of time on Left, Right and Centre from all of us here